Chapter 1. Discovery, which on their return from the wars, they introduced into their home communities. After the Crusades ceased, a flourishing trade sprang up between Europe and Asia, the metals and woods of the former being exchanged for the pearls, ivory, perfumes, and delicate fabrics of the latter. In 1299, Marco Polo, an Italian traveler who had spent many years in Cathay at the court of the Great Khan, the ruler of that region, published a book containing an account of the distant countries he had visited. This book was read by almost everybody of intelligence and greatly quickened the interest which the Crusades had already awakened in the commercial opportunities of the East. Gradually, the trade with the Orient was monopolized by the Italian commercial cities, Genoa and Venice. There were two ways of reaching the Asiatic markets. One was controlled by Genoa, the other by Venice. The Genoese sent their goods to Constantinople through the Black Sea and thence overland by trains of mules and camels to the ports on the Persian Gulf, while the merchants of Venice traded by way of Alexandria and the Red Sea. Both routes were slow, expensive, and perilous. In 1453, the Turks, a fierce barbarous people who had already overrun a large part of Asia Minor, captured Constantinople. The effect of this calamity was to block the former routes of travel and ruin the trade of the Italian cities. It then became necessary to find a new way to the east. The Portuguese believed that a new route might be found by sailing southward along the coast of Africa. In 1497, the Portuguese Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope and reached India. As Genoa and Venice declined in commercial importance, they were superseded by Portugal and Spain, and the Atlantic took the place of the Mediterranean as the highway of commerce. Columbus. Among those who studied this problem of a short sea passage was a young sailor named Christopher Columbus. He was probably born in Genoa about the year 1446, but after 1470 lived in Lisbon, supporting himself by making maps and charts for navigators. Columbus believed that the eastern countries could be reached by sailing west. He was one of the few men of his day who knew that the earth was spherical. Learned men among the ancient Greeks had known it, and the Arabians were also aware of the true form of the earth. But the Europeans of Columbus's day were extremely ignorant and believed that the earth was flat and circular like a plate. The only parts of the world with which they were at all acquainted were Europe, the British Isles, Iceland, a small portion of Asia, and the northern coast of Africa. The Atlantic Ocean was called the Sea of Darkness, and was thought to abound with monsters of strange and hideous shape, capable of devouring an entire ship and crew at a single swallow, and the English claim. For nearly a century after the voyages of Columbus, Spain had most of the field to herself. The rest of Europe was too busy with other affairs to quarrel with Spain over a new country. In 1497, England sent out John Cabot to discover any heathen regions, which up to this time have remained unknown to Christians. He was the first European to set foot on the continent of North America, landing in Labrador. England did not at that time possess sufficient naval strength to enforce her rights of discovery, and made no immediate attempt to take possession. But many years later, the English claimed the entire North American continent on the basis of Cabot's discovery, Spanish explorations and conquests. Spanish settlements were made in the West Indies, and many adventurers went far into the mainland, searching for El Dorado, the Gilded Land, where, according to current belief, mines of gold and silver waited to lavish their bursting treasures. On Easter Day 1513, Ponce de Leon, a Spanish nobleman who was looking for the fountain of youth, landed on the coast of Florida. Intelligent men of that period had faith in many follies of imagination, which even the children of this day know better than to credit. De Leon had heard and believed that somewhere in America there was a magic fountain whose waters would restore youth to aged men. He called the country Florida, after the Spanish synonym for Easter Pascua Florida, flowery Passover. In the same year, Balboa, another Spaniard, crossed the Isthmus of Panama and discovered the Pacific Ocean. In 1519, Cortés with a small army invaded Mexico and conquered that country for Spain. By 1592, the Spaniards had explored the Pacific coast from Lower California to Oregon. In 1541, Ferdinando de Soto, the Spanish governor of Cuba, while on an expedition through the Southwest, discovered the Mississippi River. St. Augustine, the oldest city in the United States, was founded by the Spaniards in 1565 to prevent the French from making settlements in Florida. Why North America did not remain Spanish? Despite a full century's undisputed right-of-way on this continent, there is not today in the law, religion, government, or other social institutions of the American people a single elemental fact that can be traced to the authorship or molding influence of Spain. A few physical landmarks, such as stone houses, walls, and cathedral ruins, scattered through Florida and the Southwest, are the melancholy vestiges of an empire long since dissolved in the testing crucible of time. For it was written on the scroll of destiny by immutable decree that o'er Columbia's virgin soil the pale emblem of Castilian pride should never wave in token of possession, nor Spanish sovereignty find enduring foothold within her spacious borders. One reason why Spanish supremacy in America failed of perpetuity is found in the character of the early settlers. They came not to till the soil, build homes, and establish civil government, but to find gold. They brought no wives or children, but in armed bands they overran the country, robbing the natives, destroying their homes, and seizing their lands. They introduced slavery and tyranny where freedom and justice should have been planted. When the gold failed to materialize, they returned to Spain. They came as plunderers, not as patriots. In short, they sowed nothing, and consequently reaped nothing. The French. In 1524, Verrazzani, a Florentine sailing under the French flag, explored the Atlantic coast of North America. 10 years later, Cartier entered the Gulf of St. Lawrence and ascended the river as far as Montreal. Champlain in 1608 founded Quebec, which became the chief seat of French power in the New World. In 1673, Marquette, a Jesuit missionary, and Joliet, a trader, explored the upper Mississippi. 9 years later, La Salle descended the river to its mouth and named the country Louisiana in honor of Louis XIV. The French built trading posts and forts along the Great Lakes and down the Mississippi River. They lived among the Indians, adopted their customs, and married their women. But they failed to establish civil government and did not attempt to form colonies of real settlers. Consequently, they also passed away, leaving but little trace of their presence. The English, the people who were to become the real founders of American institutions, were the English. They did not expect to grow rich at once, nor did they look for fountains of youth or cities with golden pavements. They came to the New World to build homes, to worship God according to the dictates of their own consciences, and to better their material conditions. They brought their families, their Bibles, and their laws. They cleared the forests, built churches and schools, planted fields, organized civil government, and established self-governing communities. In a word, they began aright, and their success was assured from the beginning. The importance of the discovery of America. The event which more than any other marks the close of the Middle Ages and the dawn of modern history is the discovery of America. It opened a new world to the enterprise of Europe and transformed the current of history. It gave a fresh stimulus to learning, industry, and commerce, furnished an outlet for the surplus population of Europe, and laid the foundation for the United States of America. When America was discovered, Europe was just emerging from the darkness of the Middle Ages. Learning was confined to the clergy and a few nobles. The common people could neither read nor write. Books were scarce and expensive. The people were deeply superstitious and extremely ignorant. A few universities had been established, but science was in its infancy. And astronomy was so little understood that even Columbus supposed he had reached the east coast of Asia when he landed in the West Indies. The discovery of America quickened the pulse of the world. It filled the minds of men with new ideas and inspired them to undertake new enterprises. It compelled a new study of geography and a broader conception of the world. It aroused the spirit of investigation and turned men's thoughts from theology and philosophy to the concrete things of the physical universe. It enlarged the horizon of hope and opened a new career to human ambition. Chapter 2. The Indians. When Columbus discovered America, he thought he had reached the Indies, and therefore called the natives Indians. Though his error was soon discovered, the name remained and has been applied ever since to the original inhabitants of the New World. Origin. The origin of the Indian race is involved in mystery. It is supposed by some that the Indians are descendants of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Others believe that they came originally from Asia. At one time, the American and Asiatic continents were probably joined by a narrow isthmus where Bering Strait now is. Some think that the people of Eastern Asia may have crossed over to Alaska and gradually peopled the continent. Distribution. The Indians were scattered over both North and South America. It is estimated that at the time of the discovery, there were 1,000 in North America, 4,000 in Mexico and Central America, and 6,000 in South America. Tribes. The various Indian tribes of North America were not all equally civilized. Some were very savage, and others had made considerable advancement. The Pueblos of New Mexico lived in houses built of stone or adobe and cultivated the soil. The Aztecs of Mexico and the Peruvians had reached a high degree of civilization. They had large cities, magnificent temples, strong governments, and vast stores of wealth. But the Indians east of the Mississippi were all savages. They lived in wigwams, wore little clothing, painted and tattooed their bodies, subsisted chiefly by hunting and fishing, and wandered from place to place in search of food. Language. There were hundreds of different Indian dialects, and it is said that the Indians of one tribe could not understand those of another. Physical characteristics. The Indians were of copper color, straight black hair, no beard, high cheekbones, small black eyes, and tall, erect form. Their faces were often hideously painted, and their heads were sometimes flattened out in infancy. Occupation. The Indian men hunted and fished. The women cultivated a small patch of ground near the wigwam, where they raised corn and beans. The Indian was too lazy to work, and would lie in his hammock all day smoking and sleeping. When not at war, he lived an idle life. Food. The Indians lived chiefly on the products of the chase, fish, corn, beans, squashes, and wild fruits. They had no cattle, horses, sheep, or pigs. They had no bread, but made a sort of cake by parching corn and pounding it in a mortar. They had no sugar, but sometimes used maple sap. They had no tea or coffee, but sometimes used sassafras tea. Weapons. The Indians' principal weapons were the bow and arrow, tomahawk, war club, and scalping knife. He made his bows from tough wood, and his arrowheads from stone or flint. He could shoot very skillfully, and rarely missed his mark. He would crawl through the grass like a snake, steal upon his enemy, kill, scalp, and be gone before he could be caught. Dress. The Indian wore very little clothing. In summer, he usually went nearly naked. In winter, he wrapped himself in a buffalo robe or a blanket made from the skins of animals. He wore moccasins on his feet and adorned his person with feathers, beads, and paint. Wigwams. The Indian's home was called a wigwam. It was made by driving poles into the ground, bending them over at the top, tying them together, and covering them with bark or skins. Sometimes it was round, sometimes conical in form. It had no windows or chimney, and only a hole in the top for the smoke to escape. Furniture. The wigwam had no furniture. The Indian sat on the ground or on a mat and slept on a bearskin. Utensils. He had a few rude tools, such as stone hammers and stone axes, and a few cooking vessels made of clay. He made baskets and wove mats of rushes. Travel. The Indian traveled on foot or in canoes made of bark. He had no horses until they were brought by the Spaniards, writing. The Indians had no written language. They sometimes communicated by picture writing on bark or skins. They also had a few signs, but their communication was mostly oral, religion. The Indians believed in one great spirit, called the Great Spirit or Manitou. They believed also in evil spirits and in a future life. They had no regular form of worship, no temples, no sacred books. They believed that good people went to the happy hunting grounds and that bad people were punished after death. Government. The government of a tribe was very simple. Each tribe had a chief called sachem, who was advised by a council of old men. Every tribe had its laws, but they were few and simple. Punishment was usually by public opinion. A man who was not brave was despised, and the fear of this kept many from wrongdoing. War. War was the Indian's chief business. When not fighting, he was usually preparing for war. He delighted in cunning, stealth, and cruelty. He would lie in ambush for days, and then rush upon his enemies with a terrible war whoop. He spared neither age nor sex. He tortured his prisoners with fire and knives, and often compelled them to run the gauntlet, scalping. One of the most horrible practices of the Indians was scalping. This consisted in tearing off the scalp of the victim with a knife. The scalp was taken as a trophy and hung up in the wigwam, or worn as an ornament. Children were taught to scalp animals. The Indian who had the most scalps was the greatest warrior. Indian character. The Indian was proud, silent, dignified, and self-controlled. He suffered pain without a murmur and met death without a groan. He had no idea of gratitude and looked upon kindness as a sign of weakness. He would take a gift today and scalp the giver tomorrow. He had no pity, no tenderness, no mercy. He was crafty, cruel, vindictive, and treacherous. He would strike down the helpless and murder the sleeping. He made a good ally, but a dangerous enemy. He was never really a friend of the white man. He hated the white race and resented its encroachments. From the beginning, the Indian was the white man's foe. Treaties were made, but the Indian never kept them. He could not be trusted. He was not capable of civilization. He refused to work, would not live in houses, and despised the restraints of law. He loved the forest, the war path, and the chase. He must either kill or be killed. Such was the Indian when the white man found him, and such he remained to the end. Summary. The Indians were the original inhabitants of America. Their origin is uncertain. They were scattered over both continents in many tribes. They were copper-colored, straight-haired, no-bearded, and tall. They were ignorant, savage, and superstitious. They lived in wigwams, wore skins, and ate game. They had no books, schools, or churches. Their religion consisted of a belief in the Great Spirit and a future life. They had simple tribal government. Their chief business was war. They were crafty, cruel, and revengeful. They hated the white man and could not be civilized. Chapter 3. Explorers and settlers. The white men who came to America in the 16th century were of 4 different nations. These were the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, and the English. The Spanish explored and settled chiefly in the south, the French in the north, the Dutch in the middle, and the English along the Atlantic coast. The Spaniards came for gold, the French for trade, the Dutch for commerce, and the English for homes. The Spaniards robbed and enslaved the natives, the French treated them as equals, the Dutch bought land from them, and the English drove them away. Each nation had its own language, laws, religion, and customs. Each made settlements in accordance with its own ideas, and the character of the people was stamped upon the colonies. Spanish explorers and settlers. The Spanish were the first white men to explore and settle in America. They came early, and they came often. They were brave, but cruel, and sought gold rather than homes. Their principal explorers were Ponce de Leon, Balboa, Cortez, De Soto, and Coronado. Ponce de Leon discovered Florida in 1513. Balboa discovered the Pacific Ocean in the same year. Cortez conquered Mexico in 1519. De Soto discovered the Mississippi River in 1541. Coronado explored the Southwest in 1542. The Spanish built St. Augustine in 1565 and Santa Fe in 1582. They established missions in Florida, New Mexico, Texas, and California. They taught the Indians the Catholic religion and compelled them to work for the mission. They built churches, converted the natives, and introduced Spanish laws, language, and customs. The Spanish rule was despotic. The governor had all power. The people had no voice in making laws or levying taxes. The Spanish did not encourage education, and there were few schools. They established no printing presses. The Catholic religion was supreme. There was no religious liberty. The Spanish intermarried with the Indians, and their children were called mestizos. The Spanish held America by right of discovery and conquest. But their colonies declined, and their power faded. They sowed oppression and reaped rebellion. French explorers and settlers. The French were the next to come. They explored the St. Lawrence River, the Great Lakes, and the Mississippi Valley. They came for trade, not for homes. They were friendly to the Indians, lived among them, and intermarried with them. Their principal explorers were Cartier, Champlain, Marquette, Joliet, and La Salle. Cartier discovered the St. Lawrence River in 1534. Champlain founded Quebec in 1608. Marquette and Joliet explored the upper Mississippi in 1673. La Salle descended the river to its mouth in 1682. The French built forts and trading posts throughout the interior. They were trappers, traders, and missionaries. They lived in the woods, adopted Indian customs, and won Indian confidence. The French government was like the Spanish. It was despotic. The king made the laws, appointed the governors, and levied the taxes. The people had no rights. There were few schools, no printing presses, and no religious liberty. The Catholic religion was supreme. The French held America by right of exploration and occupation. They claimed the entire interior of the continent, but failed to colonize it. Their government was bad, their policy was wrong, and their efforts ended in failure. Dutch explorers and settlers. The Dutch came for commerce. They were a trading people, fond of money, shrewd, and industrious. They were not explorers, but followed the discoveries of others. They bought the country from the Indians and paid a good price for it. They established trading posts on Manhattan Island and called the settlement New Amsterdam. They explored the Hudson River, built forts along its banks, and traded with the Indians. They brought Negro slaves and introduced slavery into New York. They had a good government, but allowed no religious liberty. They gave land to patroons, who brought over tenants to live on it. They were peaceable, prosperous, and contented. They left their impress on New York life. English explorers and settlers. The English were the last to come, but they came to stay. They were the best colonizers of all. They came for homes. They brought their families, their Bibles, their schools, and their religion. They settled along the Atlantic coast, built towns, cleared land, and established permanent homes. They governed themselves and had more liberty than the other colonists. They were intelligent, enterprising, and free. Their government was better, their schools were better, their religion was purer, and their homes were happier. They succeeded because they deserved to succeed. Chapter 4. English colonies. The English colonies in America were planted at different times by different people for different reasons. Some came for liberty, some for gold, some for trade, and some for homes. They were not planted by the government, but by private individuals or companies. They were all founded under a charter or written instrument from the king, authorizing the company or individual to plant a colony, make laws, and govern the people. The colonies were of three classes: royal, proprietary, and charter. A royal colony was one governed directly by the king. A proprietary colony was one given by the king to an individual, called the proprietor, who governed it as he pleased. A charter colony was one founded under a charter granted to a company, which governed itself. The colonies differed in laws, religion, customs, and manners, but were all English in origin, language, and institutions. They were 12 in number when the Revolution began. Georgia was added as the 13th just before the war. Virginia, the first permanent English colony in America, was Virginia. It was settled in 1607 by a company of English gentlemen under a charter from King James I. The settlers came to find gold. They built a fort and called the settlement Jamestown. They were lazy, quarrelsome, and idle. They did not work, but spent their time hunting for gold. They were saved from starvation by Captain John Smith, who compelled them to work. They suffered from famine, disease, and Indian attacks. In 1619, a shipload of Negroes was brought to Virginia and sold to the planters. This was the beginning of slavery in the English colonies. In the same year, a colonial assembly was called to make laws. This was the beginning of representative government in America. The colony grew slowly. It had many troubles with the Indians, especially in 1622, when a general massacre occurred. The colony passed from the control of the company to that of the king and became a royal colony. The people were mostly Church of England and intolerant of other sects. They lived on plantations, raised tobacco, and had Negro slaves. They were hospitable, high-spirited, fond of horses and hunting, and formed an aristocratic society. Massachusetts. The second English colony was Massachusetts. It was settled by the Pilgrims in 1620. They came to find liberty. They landed at Plymouth and made a compact or agreement to govern themselves. They were poor, but industrious, honest, and religious. They suffered from cold, hunger, and disease. More than half died the first winter. They were helped by the Indians and celebrated the first Thanksgiving in 1621. In 1630, the Puritans came and settled Boston. They were better off than the Pilgrims, but just as religious. They established a theocracy, or government by the church. They were very strict and punished people for dancing, smoking, or not going to church. They banished Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson for heresy. They hanged Quakers and witches. They were very intolerant, but very moral. They founded schools, colleges, and towns. They were the best educated people in the colonies. Massachusetts became the leader in the Revolution. Maryland was settled by Lord Baltimore in 1634 as a refuge for Catholics. He obtained a charter from the king and sent out 2 ships with colonists. They landed at St. Mary's and named the colony Maryland in honor of the Queen. They passed a Toleration Act allowing liberty of worship. The colony was prosperous and had good government. It became the home of religious freedom. The people raised tobacco, owned slaves, and lived like the Virginians. They were friendly to the Indians and lived in peace. Maryland was a proprietary colony, but later became royal. Other colonies. Rhode Island was settled by Roger Williams in 1636. He was banished from Massachusetts for heresy. He founded Providence and gave religious freedom to all. Rhode Island became a refuge for all persecuted people. It had the first Baptist church in America. It was the first colony to allow complete liberty of conscience. Connecticut was settled by people from Massachusetts. They founded Hartford in 1635 and adopted the Fundamental Orders, the first written constitution in America. They believed in freedom, education, and industry. They were Puritans, but less strict than those of Massachusetts. New Hampshire was settled by immigrants from Massachusetts. It had a hard struggle, but finally succeeded. It was absorbed by Massachusetts, but later separated. New York was settled by the Dutch in 1613. They called it New Netherland. They bought Manhattan Island from the Indians for 24s. They were thrifty, peaceable, and commercial. In 1664, the English took it from the Dutch and named it New York. It grew rapidly and became a great city. New Jersey was settled by the Dutch and Swedes. It was divided into East and West Jersey, but afterwards united. It became prosperous and joined in the Revolution. Pennsylvania was settled by William Penn in 1682. He was a Quaker and believed in peace. He made a treaty with the Indians and kept it. He gave religious freedom to all. He founded Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. The colony was well governed and grew fast. It was honest, peaceful, and happy. Delaware was settled by the Swedes in 1638. It was taken by the Dutch and then by the English. It belonged to Pennsylvania, but had its own assembly. The Carolinas were settled by Englishmen from Virginia and England. They raised rice, indigo, and cotton. They had large plantations and many slaves. They became separate colonies, North and South Carolina. They were royal colonies, with English church and English laws. Georgia was the last colony. It was settled by General Oglethorpe in 1733 as a refuge for poor debtors. It was named for King George II. It was a military outpost against the Spaniards. Slavery was forbidden at first, but allowed later. It became a royal colony and was loyal to the king. Chapter 5. Colonial Life. The colonists were Englishmen and brought with them English ideas, habits, customs, and laws. They were scattered along the Atlantic coast in 13 separate colonies. Each colony had its own government, laws, and institutions, but all were subject to the English king. Government. Each colony had a governor, a legislature, and courts. In the royal colonies, the governor was appointed by the king. In the proprietary colonies, he was appointed by the proprietor. In the charter colonies, he was elected by the people. The legislature consisted of two houses, council and assembly. The council was appointed, the assembly was elected. The legislature made the laws and levied the taxes. The courts administered justice. The governor had the veto power. The people voted for members of the assembly, but not for the governor. Only freeholders could vote. Religion. The colonists brought their religion with them. In the South, the Episcopal Church was established by law. In New England, the Congregational Church was supported by taxes. In Pennsylvania and Rhode Island, there was full liberty of worship. In some colonies, Quakers, Catholics, and Baptists were persecuted. Education. The colonists believed in education. They established common schools, academies, and colleges. Harvard was founded in 1636, Yale in 1701, Princeton in 1746, Columbia in 1754, Brown in 1764, Rutgers in 1766, and Dartmouth in 1769. Education was best in New England, poorest in the South. Many children were taught at home or by private tutors. Few girls went to school. There were no free public schools as now. The New England Primer was the principal school book. Printing presses were few. There were no daily papers, but some weekly ones. Books were rare, and postage very high. Customs. The colonists were plain, simple, and industrious. They rose early, worked hard, and lived frugally. The men wore knee breeches, long coats, and three-cornered hats. The women wore homespun gowns, mob caps, and high-heeled shoes. There were spinning bees, quilting bees, and barn raisings. The people helped one another. They went to church every Sunday and listened to sermons 2 hours long. They had no stoves, but used open fireplaces. There were no matches, but flint and steel. There were no lamps, but candles and tallow dips. The people rose with the sun and went to bed at dark. They spun their own thread, wove their own cloth, and made their own clothes. They cooked by the fireplace and had no stoves. They ate from pewter dishes and used wooden trenchers. They had few forks and no napkins. They had plenty to eat, but little variety. They used home remedies and had few doctors. They rode horseback or in wagons. There were few roads and no bridges. Travel was slow and dangerous. There were no steamboats, railroads, or telegraphs. The people were brave, hardy, and patriotic. They believed in liberty, law, and religion. Occupations. The principal occupations were farming, fishing, and trading. In New England, the people were fishermen, shipbuilders, and traders. They raised corn, vegetables, and cattle. They built ships and sailed them to all parts of the world. In the middle colonies, they raised grain and exported flour. They had grist mills, sawmills, and tanneries. They were thrifty and prosperous. In the southern colonies, the people raised tobacco, rice, and indigo. They had large plantations, worked by Negro slaves. They exported their products to Europe and imported their goods. Slavery. Slavery existed in all the colonies, but chiefly in the South. The Negroes were brought from Africa and sold at auction. They worked in the fields and lived in cabins. They were poorly fed, clothed, and housed. They were punished by whipping. They were ignorant, but faithful. They were sold like cattle. The masters had full power over them. Slavery was protected by law and justified by religion. Some people opposed it and tried to stop it, but it increased rapidly. Character. The colonists were brave, industrious, and religious. They believed in God, the Bible, and prayer. They trained their children to work, obey, and behave. They were plain in dress, strict in manners, and reverent in spirit. They kept the Sabbath, read the Bible, and went to church. They believed in law, order, and liberty. They trained themselves in self-government and were ready for independence. They had many hardships, but overcame them. They were poor, but contented. They had no luxuries, but many blessings. They laid the foundation of the American Republic. Chapter 6. French and Indian War. The French and Indian War was the last of 4 wars between England and France for the possession of America. The first was King William's War, the second Queen Anne's War, the third King George's War, and the fourth, the French and Indian War. The cause of all was the desire of each nation to control the American continent. The French claimed all the region drained by the St. Lawrence and Mississippi rivers. They built a line of forts from Quebec to New Orleans. The English claimed the country west of the Alleghenies and tried to prevent the French from occupying it. The final struggle came in 1754. Causes of the war. Rival claims of territory. French fort building in the Ohio Valley. English grants of land in the same region. Attacks by the French and Indians on English settlers. Beginning of the war. The war began in 1754 with a skirmish near the present site of Pittsburgh. Major George Washington, a young Virginian, was sent to drive out the French. He built Fort Necessity but was compelled to surrender. That was the beginning of the war. English plans. The English planned to attack the French at 4 points: Louisburg, Crown Point, Niagara, Fort Duquesne. They failed at every point. General Braddock was defeated in an attempt to capture Fort Duquesne. He was ambushed by the French and Indians, and his army was routed. Braddock was killed, and Washington saved the survivors. The next year, the English captured Forts Frontenac and Duquesne. Duquesne was renamed Pittsburgh. Then came the capture of Louisburg, Niagara, and Crown Point. The final blow was the capture of Quebec in 1759. General Wolfe led the English and Montcalm the French. They fought on the Plains of Abraham. Both generals were killed, but the French were defeated. Quebec surrendered, and the war was practically ended. Close to the war. The war was closed by the Treaty of Paris, 1763. Its terms were: France gave up all her possessions in America. England received Canada and all territory east of the Mississippi. Spain received New Orleans and all west of the Mississippi. Spain gave Florida to England. Effects of the war. France was driven from America. England became supreme in the New World. The colonists learned to fight. Washington gained fame. The colonists learned the value of union. They lost respect for British officers. They gained confidence in themselves. The Indians were subdued. The frontier was pushed westward. The Revolution was made possible. Chapter 7. Causes of the Revolution. The American Revolution was caused by the attempt of England to tax the colonies without their consent. The colonists claimed that taxation without representation was tyranny. England claimed that Parliament had the right to tax them. The colonists claimed that only their own assemblies could levy taxes. Out of this dispute grew the War of the Revolution. Causes of the Revolution: taxation without representation, restriction of colonial manufactures, limitation of trade, navigation laws, writs of assistance, quartering of troops, dissolution of legislatures, denial of jury trial, interference with religion, presence of British troops, influence of French and Indian War, the spirit of liberty. Writings of patriots, desire for independence, explanation of causes. The colonists had been left to govern themselves. They had their own legislatures and levied their own taxes. They had no representation in Parliament. They did not vote for members of that body and had no voice in its deliberations. When Parliament began to tax them, they denied its right to do so. They were willing to be taxed by their own legislatures, but not by a body 3,000 miles away. England passed the Stamp Act in 1765. It required a stamp on all legal documents, newspapers, and pamphlets. The colonists resisted it. They formed the Stamp Act Congress and declared that Parliament had no right to tax them. They refused to buy stamps, and the act was repealed. Then came the Townshend Acts, imposing duties on glass, paint, paper, and tea. These were also resisted. The colonists agreed not to import goods from England. They organized societies called Sons of Liberty. They made tea drinking unpopular. They used homemade articles. They wore homespun. They denounced the tax and declared that England had no right to enforce it. England repealed all the duties except that on tea. This was retained to show that Parliament had the right to tax. The Boston Tea Party. In 1773, England sent several shiploads of tea to America. The colonists refused to buy it. At Boston, a party of men disguised as Indians boarded the ships and threw the tea into the harbor. This was called the Boston Tea Party. It aroused the anger of Parliament. It passed the Boston Port Bill, closing the port of Boston. It passed other laws called the Intolerable Acts. It sent troops to enforce them. The colonies called a Congress to meet at Philadelphia in 1774. This was called the First Continental Congress. It declared that taxation without representation was tyranny. It denied the right of Parliament to tax the colonies. It pledged the colonies to support Massachusetts. It agreed to stop trade with England. It recommended the training of militia. It resolved to meet again if grievances were not redressed. This was the beginning of union. Effect of these events: the colonies grew more united. They began to prepare for war. They trained their militia, collected arms, and formed committees of safety. They read the writings of Otis, Henry, Adams, Dickinson, and Jefferson. They became more patriotic. They began to talk of independence. Chapter 8. The Revolution. The Revolution began in 1775 and closed in 1783. It was caused by taxation without representation. It was fought to establish American independence. The colonies declared their independence in 1776 and secured it in 1783. The struggle lasted 8 years. The colonies had no army, no navy, no money, and no government. They fought against the greatest power in the world. They were ill-armed, ill-clothed, and ill-fed. They were often defeated, but never conquered. They endured hardship, suffering, and loss. They won by courage, perseverance, and patriotism. First blood. The first battle of the war was at Lexington, April 19th, 75. A company of Minutemen met the British and fired the first shot. The British then marched to Concord and destroyed some military stores. On their return, they were attacked by the Americans and lost many men. This was called the Battle of Lexington and Concord. It aroused the whole country. Thousands of men seized their muskets and marched to Boston. The Revolutionary War had begun. Bunker Hill. The first regular battle was at Bunker Hill, June 17th, 75. The Americans entrenched themselves on Breed's Hill. The British marched up the hill 3 times. They were repulsed twice, but succeeded the 3rd time. The Americans ran out of powder and were compelled to retreat. The British gained the hill, but lost more men than the Americans. It was a victory, but a costly one. The Americans showed that they could fight. It gave them confidence and increased their courage. Washington in command. Congress appointed George Washington commander-in-chief. He took command of the army at Cambridge, July 3, 1775. He found a disorderly crowd, without discipline or supplies. He organized, trained, and inspired them. He planned to drive the British from Boston. He fortified Dorchester Heights and placed cannon there. The British could not hold the city and sailed away, March 17, 1776. The Americans entered Boston in triumph. Declaration of Independence. The colonies were still under the king. They hoped for justice, but the king refused to hear them. He hired German soldiers, called Hessians, to fight them. The colonies then decided to separate. Congress appointed a committee to write a Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson wrote it. It was adopted July 4, 1776. It declared the colonies free and independent states. It stated the reasons for separation. It proclaimed the right of the people to govern themselves. It was read to the army and the people. It was hailed with joy. The colonies were now the United States. Campaigns of the war. The war had many campaigns and was fought in 3 principal sections, North, Middle, and South. The British captured New York in 1776 and held it till the end of the war. Washington crossed the Delaware and won the battles of Trenton and Princeton. These victories saved the cause. In 1777, the British planned to cut off New England. Burgoyne came from Canada, but was surrounded and forced to surrender at Saratoga. This was the turning point of the war. It led to the alliance with France. France recognized our independence and sent ships, soldiers, and money. Spain and Holland also joined us. The British then changed their plan and tried to conquer the South. They captured Savannah and Charleston. They defeated Gates at Camden. But Greene took command and fought the famous campaign of the South. He won no great battles, but wore out the enemy. The final campaign was in Virginia. Cornwallis took position at Yorktown. Washington marched against him. The French fleet cut off retreat by sea. Cornwallis was surrounded and forced to surrender, October 19, 1781. This ended the war. The Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783. It recognized our independence. It gave us all the country east of the Mississippi, north of Florida, and south of Canada. Chapter 9. The Confederation. When independence was declared, the colonies became free and independent states. Each state had its own government, laws, and institutions. They were 13 separate republics. They formed a union for defense, but not for government. They adopted Articles of Confederation, but they were weak. They had no president, no Supreme Court, and no power to enforce laws. Each state had one vote. Congress could not tax, could not raise troops, could not regulate trade. It could only recommend. It depended on the states for money and men. The government was weak, slow, and inefficient. The people lost confidence in it. Condition of the country. The country was poor. The war had cost much. There was a large debt. There was no money to pay it. There was no national credit. Each state issued its own money. There was no uniform currency. Trade was disordered. There were no banks, no manufactures, and no commerce. There was no navy, and the army had been disbanded. The country was weak at home and despised abroad. The people were discouraged. The Northwest Territory. The states had conflicting claims to western lands. Some claimed to the Mississippi, others to the Pacific. Congress asked the states to give up their claims. They did so, and the territory was ceded to the Union. It was called the Northwest Territory. It included the present states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Congress passed the Ordinance of 1787, organizing the territory. It provided a territorial government, no slavery, freedom of religion, trial by jury, free schools, admission of new states on equal terms. It was the greatest act of the Confederation. Need of a stronger government. The people saw the need of a better government. The states were jealous of each other. They taxed each other's goods. They refused to obey Congress. They issued worthless money. They oppressed minorities. They resisted authority. There was danger of anarchy. Shays' Rebellion broke out in Massachusetts. It alarmed the people. They demanded a change. The Constitutional Convention. A convention was called to revise the Articles. It met at Philadelphia in 1787. It was composed of the best men of the country. Washington was president. Franklin was the oldest member. Hamilton, Madison, and others were present. They decided to form a new government. They debated for 4 months. They adopted the Constitution. It provided a national government, 3 branches, legislative, executive, and judicial. Congress to make laws, President to execute them, Supreme Court to interpret them, power to tax, raise troops, and regulate commerce. Equal rights to all states, liberty to the people. It was signed September 17th, 1787. It was sent to the states for ratification. After a hard struggle, it was adopted by all. The new government was organized in 1789. Washington was elected first president. The Constitution has proved a success. It is the greatest document ever written by man. It is the foundation of the American Republic. Chapter 6. The Constitution. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land. It is the foundation of the government. It was adopted to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty. It has 3 departments: legislative, executive, and judicial. Legislative department. This is called Congress. It makes the laws. It consists of 2 houses, Senate and House of Representatives. The Senate has 2 members from each state, elected for 6 years. The House is composed of members from each state, according to population. They are elected for 2 years. Congress meets annually. It has power to lay taxes, borrow money, regulate commerce, coin money, declare war, raise armies, make rules for the Army and Navy, establish post offices, grant patents, and do whatever is necessary. It cannot pass ex post facto laws, bills of attainder, or laws impairing contracts. It cannot grant titles of nobility. It cannot tax exports from any state. Executive Department. This is the President. He is elected for 4 years. He is Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy. He makes treaties, appoints officers, calls special sessions, vetoes bills, and executes the laws. He is aided by a cabinet of advisors. He must be a natural-born citizen, 35 years old, and 14 years a resident. Judicial Department. This is the Supreme Court. It interprets the laws and decides disputes. It consists of a Chief Justice and 8 Associate Justices. They are appointed for life. The court tries cases arising under the Constitution, laws, and treaties. It decides disputes between states, citizens, and foreign nations. Bill of Rights. The first 10 amendments are called the Bill of Rights. They were adopted to secure personal liberty. They provide freedom of religion, speech, and the press, right of the people to assemble, right to bear arms. No quartering of soldiers in peace, security against unreasonable searches, right of trial by jury, protection against double jeopardy, no cruel or unusual punishment, liberty of the people. Powers not given to the United States belong to the states. Other amendments. There are now 15 amendments. They provide a state cannot be sued by a citizen of another state, separate ballots for president and vice president, abolition of slavery, civil rights to all citizens, right of suffrage regardless of race. Chapter Gistist, the first president. The Constitution went into effect in 1789. Washington was elected the first president. He took the oath of office in New York, April 30th, 1789. He had been commander-in-chief of the army and was loved and trusted by all. He was grave, dignified, honest, and patriotic. He selected a cabinet of able men. Jefferson was Secretary of State, Hamilton Secretary of the Treasury, Knox Secretary of War, and Randolph Attorney General. The First Congress. The First Congress passed many important laws. It organized the departments, created the courts, provided revenue, and adopted the Bill of Rights. It laid the foundation of the government, the public debt. The Revolution left a debt of $75,000. Hamilton proposed a plan to pay it. He asked that the government assume the state debts and fund the whole by a new issue of bonds. Congress adopted the plan. It restored public credit. The people had confidence in the government. The new bonds were worth their face value. The old were worth little. This made a difference. The capital was located at Washington. The North wanted Assumption, the South wanted the capital. So, the two were traded. The National Bank. Hamilton proposed a national bank. It was to issue notes, hold deposits, lend money, and aid the government. Jefferson opposed it. He said it was unconstitutional. Hamilton said it was implied. Washington signed the bill. The bank was established. It helped business and trade. It gave the government control of finance. It caused the first political parties. The Whiskey Rebellion. Congress laid a tax on whiskey. The people of western Pennsylvania refused to pay it. They attacked the officers and defied the government. Washington called out the militia. He marched in person to the scene. The rebels dispersed, and the law was obeyed. The French Revolution. The French Revolution broke out in 1789. The French people overthrew their king and established a republic. They declared war against England. They asked our help. Many Americans favored them. But Washington issued a proclamation of neutrality. He said we would be friendly to all and ally with none. This was the beginning of our foreign policy. Jay's Treaty. England seized our ships and impressed our sailors. Washington sent John Jay to make a treaty. It provided England to vacate western posts, damages to be paid for seizures, trade to be opened with the West Indies. It was unpopular, but it preserved peace. Farewell Address. Washington declined a third term. He published a farewell address. He advised union of the states, obedience to the Constitution, avoidance of parties, honesty in government, education of the people, neutrality in foreign affairs. It is a great state paper. Chapter 2. John Adams Washington declined a third term. John Adams was elected second president. He was a patriot, a statesman, and a scholar. He had signed the Declaration, been minister to France, Holland, and England, and was vice president 8 years. He was honest, able, and fearless. But he lacked tact. He made many enemies. The XYZ affair. France was angry because of Jay's Treaty. She seized our ships and insulted our flag. Adams sent Pinckney, Marshall, and Gerry to make a treaty. They were asked to pay a bribe. They refused. They sent home dispatches. The French agents were called X, Y, and Z. The people cried, millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute. They prepared for war. They built ships, raised troops, and appointed Washington commander. Adams sent another mission, and a treaty was made. The war was averted. The Alien and Sedition Laws Congress passed laws to punish foreigners and editors. They gave the president power to expel aliens. They fined and imprisoned editors for criticizing the government. They were denounced as unconstitutional. They made the Federalists unpopular. They helped defeat Adams. The Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. Jefferson and Madison wrote resolutions declaring the alien and sedition laws null and void. They claimed that a state could set aside a law of Congress. This was the beginning of state rights. It was the foundation of secession. The resolutions were not accepted, but they caused much discussion. The capital. The seat of government was moved to Washington in 1800. It was a little village in the woods. The public buildings were few and plain. The Capitol was unfinished. The White House was small. The streets were unpaved. The city was muddy and forlorn. The election. The next election was exciting. The Federalists supported Adams and the Republicans Jefferson. There was a tie between Jefferson and Burr. The House of Representatives decided. Jefferson was elected president and Burr vice president. This caused the 12th Amendment. Chapter the Thani, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was the third president. He wrote the Declaration of Independence, was Minister to France, Secretary of State, and Vice President. He was a man of the people. He believed in liberty, equality, and economy. He walked to the Capitol and delivered his inaugural address. He said, "We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists." His policy was economy, peace, and simplicity. He reduced the Army and Navy, paid the debt, and cut down expenses. The Louisiana Purchase. In 1803, Jefferson bought Louisiana from France. It included all the land west of the Mississippi to the Rocky Mountains. It cost $15,000. It doubled our territory. It gave us control of the Mississippi. It removed a foreign power. It was the greatest act of Jefferson's administration. Lewis and Clark. Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark to explore the new country. They went up the Missouri, crossed the mountains, and followed the Columbia to the Pacific. They made maps, kept journals, and described the country. They were gone over 2 years. Their journey opened the way to the Northwest. The Tripolitan War. The pirates of Tripoli captured our ships, enslaved our sailors, and demanded tribute. Jefferson sent the Navy to stop them. They bombarded Tripoli and forced a treaty. It was the first foreign war. It showed the power of the Navy. It secured our commerce. The embargo. England and France were at war. Each tried to injure the other. They captured our ships and impressed our sailors. England was most aggressive. She took our sailors by force. She claimed the right to search our vessels. She fired on the Chesapeake. This aroused the country. Jefferson did not want war. He persuaded Congress to pass the Embargo Act. It forbade all trade with foreign nations. It was intended to bring England to terms. It injured us more than them. It destroyed our commerce. It caused distress. It made Jefferson unpopular. It was repealed just before he retired. Chapter the 4th. James Madison. Madison was the 4th president. He was the father of the Constitution. He was Secretary of State under Jefferson. He was wise, prudent, and patriotic. His administration was troubled with foreign affairs. Causes of the war. England interfered with our commerce. She impressed our sailors. She armed the Indians. She insulted our flag. She refused redress. Congress declared war, June 18, 1812. It was called the War of 1812. It lasted 2.5 years. It was fought to preserve our rights. Preparation. We were not ready. The army was small. The navy was weak. The country was divided. New England opposed the war. The South and West favored it. The war on land. We tried to invade Canada. We failed. Our armies were defeated. Hull surrendered Detroit. Dearborn failed. Van Rensselaer failed. Winchester was defeated. The army was reorganized. Harrison won the Battle of the Thames. Perry won the Battle of Lake Erie. Scott won battles on the Niagara. The war at sea. The Navy won glory. It defeated British ships in single combat. The Constitution captured the Guerriere. The Wasp took the Frolic. The United States captured the Macedonian. The Enterprise took the Boxer. The Peacock took the Hornet. Privateers. Privateers preyed on British commerce. They captured many prizes. They annoyed the enemy. They helped win the war. Defeat and victory. The British burned Washington. They attacked Baltimore, but were repulsed. They bombarded Fort McHenry. Francis Scott Key wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. The British attacked New Orleans. Jackson defeated them. The battle was fought after peace. It made Jackson famous. Treaty of Ghent. The treaty was signed December 24th, 1814. It ended the war. It said nothing about the causes, but they ceased. The war gave us respect. It united the people. It aroused patriotism. It made us independent. Chapter 15. James Monroe. Monroe was the 5th president. He had fought in the Revolution, been minister to France and England, and governor of Virginia. He was a wise, prudent, and honest man. His administration was called the Era of Good Feeling. The people were prosperous and contented. There were no parties. All were Republicans. The Seminole War. Florida was a Spanish province. The Seminoles made raids into Georgia. Monroe sent Jackson to stop them. He marched into Florida, seized the forts, and punished the Indians. Spain protested, but the people approved. Spain sold Florida to the United States. The Missouri Compromise. Missouri asked admission as a slave state. This caused great excitement. The North opposed it, the South favored it. A compromise was made. Missouri was admitted with slavery. Maine was admitted without it. Slavery was prohibited north of 36 during 30E. This was called the Missouri Compromise. The Monroe Doctrine. The nations of South America declared independence from Spain. They set up republics. The Holy Alliance planned to restore the kings. Monroe opposed it. He declared that America was no longer open to colonization. That European interference in America would not be allowed. That the United States would not interfere in Europe. This was called the Monroe Doctrine. It was approved by the people. It has become a principle of American policy. It has kept Europe out of America. Internal improvements. Monroe favored internal improvements. He signed bills for roads, canals, and harbors. But he opposed anything unconstitutional. He was a strict constructionist. He gave us a good civil service. He retired with honor. He was succeeded by John Quincy Adams. Chapter 16. John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams was the 6th president. He was the son of John Adams. He had been minister to several countries, senator, secretary of state, and treaty maker. He was a man of learning, honor, and industry. He believed in liberty and right. He was not popular. He had few friends. His manners were cold. He was called the old man, eloquent. The election. The election of 1824 was exciting. There were 4 candidates, Jackson, Adams, Crawford, and Clay. No one had a majority. The House of Representatives elected Adams. This made Jackson's friends angry. They called it a corrupt bargain. They opposed Adams. They defeated his plans. They prepared to elect Jackson. Internal improvements. Adams believed in internal improvements. He recommended roads, canals, and harbors. He favored science and education. He asked aid for schools, libraries, and observatories. Congress refused. He had little influence. He served 1 term. After his presidency, Adams was elected to Congress. He served many years. He was the ablest member. He opposed slavery and the slave trade. He presented petitions. He made speeches. He defied the South. He was the champion of liberty. He fell at his post. He died in the Capitol. He was mourned by the people. His name is honored. He was great as president, but greater after he left office. Chapter 16. Andrew Jackson. Jackson was the 7th president. He was born in a log cabin. He was poor, brave, and ambitious. He fought in the Revolution. He studied law. moved west, and became a judge. He was a soldier, senator, and general. He won the Battle of New Orleans. He was a man of the people. He was stern, fearless, and patriotic. He believed in democracy. He had great influence. His friends were devoted. His enemies were bitter. He had 2 terms. The spoils system. Jackson removed many officials. He appointed his friends. He said, "To the victors belong the spoils." This began the spoils system. It led to corruption. It caused civil service reform. The Bank Congress established a national bank. Jackson opposed it. He said it was unconstitutional. He vetoed the bill to renew it. He removed the deposits. He put them in state banks. This caused a panic. Business was disturbed. Banks failed. People suffered. But Jackson was sustained. He destroyed the bank. He was re-elected by a great majority. Nullification. South Carolina opposed the tariff. She said it was unconstitutional. She declared it null and void. She threatened secession. Jackson said he would enforce the law. He sent troops and ships. Congress passed a compromise. South Carolina gave up. The Union was saved. Removal of Indians. Jackson favored removal of Indians. They were in the South. They had land and homes. He said they must go west. He used the army. The Cherokees were driven out. They suffered much. But the land was open to settlers. The national debt. Jackson paid off the national debt. It was the only time in our history. He left the treasury full. He was proud of it. He retired in 1837. He was honored by the people. He died in 1845. His name is great in American history. Chapter 17, Martin Van Buren. Van Buren was the 8th president. He was born in New York. He was a lawyer, senator, governor, minister, and vice president. He was a man of ability. He was shrewd, wary, and polite. He was called the Little Magician. He believed in Jackson's policy. He continued it. The Panic of 1837. A great panic occurred in 1837. Banks failed. Business stopped. People were ruined. There was no money. There was no work. There was much distress. The causes were removal of deposits, speculation in lands, extravagance, loss of confidence. Van Buren proposed the sub-treasury. It provided that government funds be kept in vaults. It separated the government from the banks. It was passed by Congress. It is still in use.
If you found this video insightful and engaging, don't forget to give it a like to support the channel. Be sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming historical videos. Feel free to leave a comment below with your thoughts or suggestions for future topics. Thank you for watching.